Hey, my name is John. I'm a 29-year-old entrepreneur from California, and I moved from San Francisco, which is known as the promised land of startups, to Kiev, Ukraine, which is a place that many people are actually trying to escape from. I'm going to explain to you a little bit about why I did this, why I left San Francisco, what interested me about Ukraine, and also go into a lot of the pros and the cons that I've learned from living here from 2 years, and wrap up with a brief conclusion. So for a bit of context, the story started because I was working on the Game Tree project, and it's essentially about helping people discover games and friends in an increasingly super crowded and lonely world. I moved to San Francisco, learned how to code, was sold on all the promise of it being the greatest place to start a startup, but I actually learned over the course of a few years that it's actually the worst place to start an early stage tech company. Being in San Francisco, you're essentially a small fish in a really big sea, and that's a bad place to be in. It's hard to recruit people out of companies like YouTube and Facebook. The cost of living is really high, and it's hard to stand out in a city where there's like 10,000 other startups. I'm really passionate about this project though, so I was able to actually recruit a team of about 15 volunteers to work on Game Tree. But in the end, just trying to make this thing a reality was really painful, because when people are working full-time jobs, they're gonna put their attention and most of their effort where the bread's coming from. And so I found I spent as much time managing as actually getting work done, and I knew I had to change something. I remember I met a guy at a crazy hacker house in a ghetto named Andre. And he'd just arrived from Ukraine with a thick accent, and this guy can code on blockchain faster than I can even type. And this is like 5 or 6 years ago, before blockchain was even much of a thing. Andre is really cool, independent thinker, smart, philosophical, highly driven. And I realized if there's people like Andre in Ukraine, I needed to go find and work with these people before they get to San Francisco. At this time, I'd had a lot of bad experiences outsourcing to different parts of the world, maybe 12, 13 countries, because people would just do what I told them to. But in Ukraine, people have a reputation for thinking for themselves, for offering their own ideas and telling you when your ideas are stupid. And in a startup, this is great. Now, when I met Andre, it was around the time of Maidan. And before that, I knew almost nothing about Ukraine. But what I found is that I actually was really admiring and respecting the people in Ukraine for standing up to an oppressive government, especially in stark contrast to in the West, where people are so comfortable that we almost never do anything that risky or special or amazing anymore, because it's just not a normal thing to do. There were a couple more factors, for example, just wanting to have an adventure and also hearing that this is a land where there's possibly the most beautiful woman in the world. But overall, the biggest reason is just understanding that Ukraine has a lot of really smart people without a lot of opportunities. And as an entrepreneur, I have this opportunity where I need people to be able to help bring it to life. Upon arriving in Kiev, after dealing with the coup d'etat in Istanbul, the first thing I was amazed by were the low prices. I mean, I was expecting this, but a 35-minute cab ride only costed $20. That's like a third or a quarter of what it would be in San Francisco. And that was with me getting ripped off. It was a kind of mixed negative experience at first, but in general, there's actually a really high level of civil order in Ukraine for being a lower income country. And that's actually the only time in about 2.5 years now that I ever got ripped off. Now in Ukraine, there are some bureaucracy and corruption issues, like importing things. If it's a certain value, there's super high, crazy taxes. Being able to get residency can be a challenge. So that's something that you have to deal with sometimes, but as a local, it can be a little bit harder. For me, I didn't have to deal with a whole lot because at first, as an American, I could just come and leave the country freely, pay a small fine. Now the EU is watching Ukraine a little bit closer, so they're starting to enforce these laws more. So I've had to figure out a residency plan. When I came to Ukraine, I had a return ticket for 12 days later. And by the third day, I'd actually decided that I wanted to skip the return flight just because I found Ukraine and the people there so awesome and genuine and fun, and the prices were so good to the level of safety and comfort, authenticity and quality, that it just seemed like a no-brainer to me that instead of just hiring a team and leaving, that this was a good place to set up shop. Something that has struck me right before arriving and upon arriving is just how much the people there love foreigners, and that just made me feel really welcome and like I immediately had more of a home than I normally would be being in a new country. For example, I put an ad on Couchsurfing, and about 20 or 30 people reached out to me offering to host me or to show me around or help me with things. And it was just so much warmth and generosity from strangers that it was incredible. And since then, I've tried to use Couchsurfing in a few different countries, and as a single male traveler, I've never gotten anybody to even offer to host me. The infrastructure in Ukraine is a little bit worse than in the West, but if you have money, you can find a gym with nicer equipment or the nicer restaurants. But in general, things are going to be a little bit shoddier looking around. I personally don't really care because once you get comfortable, life just mellows out and that becomes normal. It's not like all of the people in history before now were super miserable because they didn't have air conditioning and cars. And I think that's kind of a sad perception that a lot of Ukrainians have of America, is that because it looks good on TV and in music, that they think everybody there is amazing. But the reality is just people in central Kiev that I know are just as happy as the average Californians, maybe even happier, because they spend more time with their families and not rushing life and being able to enjoy things and engage in a broad variety of poetry and history and music in ways that most Americans don't really have that much context or understanding of. In general, I found people to be very warm, helpful. For example, I asked somebody at a bank for something, and they literally left the bank and walked me to the place I was looking for. And that's not something that you get in America. People in Ukraine are also not that racist. It's a sort of misconception in America that we think we're racist. I mean, racism is bad, but Americans are actually some of the least racist people in the world. But in Ukraine, people really admire foreigners. And maybe it's because they're not as elitist about their own culture, coming from more of a humble, sort of almost peasant style compared to like Western Europe's castles and royalty, that people here are just way more chill and laid back with themselves and others. One thing that was endearing at first, but it gets really frustrating after a while, is that almost everybody I meet looks at me like I'm a crazy person when they find out that I moved from California to Ukraine. And it gets a little tiresome to explain that Ukraine's actually a really cool place. And they start to get it once I give them the reasons, but it's just such a thing that's programmed into people here, is to not appreciate their own country. And it's something I really wish people saw more, because Ukraine really is a beautiful gem. And California is somewhere that's really marketed and sold a lot, that it's this wonderful place when people there aren't necessarily happier or sadder than most other places in the world. Something that's a little bit harder with some of the people here, especially for my point of view as somebody who's extremely value-driven and an abstract, intuitive, big-picture thinker, is that's not quite as common here, where people value short-term money over long-term payouts, or they want cash instead of equity. And in a startup, sometimes those things are what you motivate people by, so cash does matter more, but the thing is, the prices are so worth it that being able to preserve a lot of equity or still be able to get things done by people working full-time is really nice. In general, since then, I've been able to build up a team of 12 people full-time working on this project, and things are running pretty smooth. I don't have many interpersonal issues. I don't know if this is fully due to Ukrainian work ethic, or if it's because of a lot of knowledge of personality psychology and hiring people for the right jobs and management and leadership. I think a big part of it actually is that the Soviet Union did not produce a lot of good leaders because people just had automatic authority. And in the West, you have to kind of convince people to follow you and inspire them. So I think some of the people that are working on the Game Tree project have been burned by bad managers in the past. So they're pretty happy, even if the company isn't quite as stable, or I'm not paying them quite as much as they possibly could be making in other places. But overall, it's been really great, and I'm really happy with the team that's been built here. And we've been able to make a lot more than I'd ever be able to make in California, where with the amount of money that I'm paying this team, I could afford much fewer people and be able to get a lot less done. A side effect of moving to Ukraine that I didn't expect is that I have a lot more headspace. For example, I can walk down the road and not be distracted by other people's conversations or advertisements as much, because I don't understand Russian and Ukrainian. And in general, there's a little bit less advertising than there is in California. And this is really cool because I can just sort of focus and tune out into my thoughts or music or whatever I'm doing without as many distractions that are so everywhere these days. But when it comes to learning Russian and Ukrainian, these are really hard languages. I'm almost fluent in Spanish, but Russian and Ukrainian just have so many more rules that it causes me like physical pain. It's the hardest part of my week. I like tremble when I have Russian lessons. But the thing is, I really like Ukraine and I want to be here and I want to be able to hang out with people in their local tongues and be able to understand things better and make that long-term investment. But it's just really challenging because it's such a difficult language, and so many of the people that I know and work with and friends that I have here speak English. And the reason I've chosen to focus more on Russian is because I started learning it before moving here a little bit. And then upon moving here, I thought that it's the bigger language, it's more useful for business. But the longer I'm here, the more I'm wishing I learned Ukrainian. But the plan is to learn that after I learn enough Russian to be able to communicate freely. Something I do wish there was more of here, though, was complete fluency in English. Like, I find I have to be doing a lot of videos myself, or doing a lot of the writing, or in general just social media and anything external, because people here aren't used to selling. In the Soviet Union, you're given a quota, and then you do that quota, then you give it to somebody else. It's not as built into the culture and in generations of knowledge to be able to sell and market, especially to Western countries. On the flip side, though, starting up here had some unexpected benefits. For example, Game Tree needs a lot of data to be able to train our machine learning algorithms. to be able to recommend games and friends. And here, it's a lot easier to find users because there's less competition, and also ads and stuff are a lot cheaper. And data is data, people are people, so that was a really big side effect of coming here that I did not expect. Another one alongside that is just being able to get all the user feedback quickly. I imagine that things with GameTree would be moving a lot faster than they did, but it's just a constant process of trying to pivot in the right direction. And we've been getting so much user feedback based on all of this operations here that we've gotten to the product now to a state where it's actually really good. But it took a lot of time and money to get it there that in the West would have cost like 5-10 times more. It's nice for an entrepreneur that the large majority of the workforce here in tech is on a contract basis. So you don't have to deal with as much taxes and employment regulations and paperwork. And for them, it's really simple to just be an independent entrepreneur where they pay a small percent to the government. So that's like a huge, huge benefit, especially for a startup when you don't have that much time and you have really limited resources. It is a bit challenging to move money in and out of the country though. There's a lot of corruption and laws and regulations to prevent money laundering. So for the first year, that was a big struggle. But eventually I discovered TransferWise, which made things a little bit easier with a little bit lower commissions. But the biggest holy grail for me has actually been cryptocurrencies. So I just pay the team in Ethereum and it takes minutes. They can sell them immediately on a local market and the transaction fees are really small. When it comes to raising money for GameTree, that part's actually really challenging because there's about 1% as much capital per capita. And the first place entrepreneurs usually look and get funded is from local VCs. Combined with that is that Ukrainians, preferring to see the short-term prize, really value early profitability in sales. And the kind of company I'm working on is sort of a moonshot, possible unicorn, but it's not the kind of company that's going to monetize right away. It's better to build something, build a monopoly, and then build a moat around that. And that's not the kind of business model that Ukrainians like. Overall, what I found though is that I was a bigger fish in a smaller sea relatively. Whereas in San Francisco, being the small fish is the hardest position, suddenly by being the bigger fish, I found that it was easier to make friends, give talks, do business, get PR. Even upon arriving, actually a news piece about me came out that went viral and got shared by thousands of people in the country just for moving there from San Francisco. Because so many people in Ukraine are trying to leave because they want a higher quality of life, that the idea of moving from San Francisco to there is a totally backwards short-circuited thought. But since moving there, I've met so many people from Ukraine, and a few who have actually worked at Google who have come back to Ukraine. An example of a benefit of being a big fish in the smaller pond is that I was recruited to help with a Connect Ukraine festival about showcasing a lot of the things that Ukraine has to offer. Because in general, it's really true that Ukraine has so much more to share than the amount of attention it gets and the reputation it has abroad. People think of Ukraine with corruption and war and revolution, but it's actually really amazing here, and it's a false perception because things are actually really stable and safe on the ground. So getting dragged into this project, I just met so many cool people who all rose to the occasion, and people here really do want to be part of something bigger. And this guy Jorgen was such an inspirational figure that he rallied all these people to start this conference very quickly. We got a big space, and it was just so nice being wrapped up in this thing and expanding my tribe. And through this, I ended up meeting the Yushchenko family, the ex-presidents who helped with the Orange Revolution. And I never expected to be hanging out on such a sort of friendly family level with these people that after living many, many years in America never happened. But those sorts of things in Ukraine are a lot more common. Even a lot of my foreign friends here from France and England and America have all found really big success upon coming here, where before they were just kind of nobodies or just small people. And it's just sort of this pattern that I found with people that I know, that foreigners who come here tend to do really well and be really happy. To sum up my thoughts on Ukraine, and especially from the point of view of an entrepreneur, is I did find a home here and accomplish the objectives of recruiting a team. It's a little bit harder to market outside of Ukraine, which is something we're gonna have to do more as we're growing. But in general, I'm really happy with the team and being able to operate on low costs. At the same time though, something I found is that it's really hard to raise money, especially with the way the markets are and with gaming and being in Ukraine. So that's been a bit of a challenge that I don't think I would have had in other places. And right now the world is overflowing with money. I think we're about to be before a recession. So there's too much money in the economy and it's not really shifting to Ukraine. So part of me second guesses that opinion, but at the end of the day, I know that in San Francisco, starting this company wasn't even an option. Because to be able to get from 0 to X, where the company becomes investable, just wasn't something I could do with all of the costs incurred and all of the competition there. So in that sense, moving to Ukraine was a major success. Lifestyle-wise here, I found a lot of good friends, both local and foreign, And I feel like I have a strong sense of purpose and that I give a lot of talks and give a lot of advice to people that don't really need so much stuff in America. And it feels really good just being able to help and give back in that way. For the most part, I'm really happy with my decision to move to Ukraine. The main thing that drives me though is the startup, so I'm going to do whatever it takes to make that successful. But if you're somebody who's thinking about moving to Ukraine or somebody who's considering leaving, hopefully a lot of this information was helpful to you and provided at least some new insights.